Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 4th of October 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we're delighted to be joined by Vanessa Beeley today. A lot happening, but we better kick off with really the great effort by the Daily Telegraph to undermine Mike Veal's report into alleged child abuse with former Prime Minister Ted Heath. The Telegraph has worked harder, we think, than any other national paper to try and discredit this police investigation at every turn. Here's one of the reports: Heath's sex inquiry to allege the former Prime Minister abused youngsters at sea. But in the article itself, it then adds, but really this would have been impossible because he couldn't sail the boat on his own. And remember that the Wiltshire Police report into these allegations against former Prime Minister Edward Heath should be out tomorrow or possibly on the 6th. But I think the establishment is sweating Mike. And of course, this is getting to the heart of what drives British politics: corruption, criminality and child abuse. And as the former Tory whip Tim Fortescue said to BBC Camera, MPs came to us, the whips, with their problems. That included little boys, and we fixed those problems so the MPs would do as they were asked. He's talking about blackmail there, Mike.
Absolutely. Of course, mainstream media not covering anything that's going on with the inquiry at the moment. Is there even an inquiry at the moment? No one knows.
Stunning silence.
Stunning silence, which makes it all a bit ironic. Because the government's answer to all this is to invest £600,000 into what they describe as groundbreaking technology that allows internet companies to identify and remove indecent images of children from websites. It's being promoted or being produced by this Canadian company, cybertip.ca. It's called Project Arachnid, and apparently what it does is it fingerprints certain types of images, and then if it identifies those images on social media or other websites, it flags that up, and the owners of the websites are contacted and given the opportunity to do something about it. So that's their answer, Brian, to stick £600,000, which is a pitiful amount of money, into one cyber project to identify indecent images of children. In the meantime, what are they doing to actually identify the people that are making the indecent images of children in the first place?
Nothing.
Or that are trafficking the children from the Middle East, from Africa, from East Asia, and so on? Nothing. So what are they doing about children who have gone missing from the care system?
Precisely nothing. What are they doing about the whistleblowers, including, of course, John Wedger from the Metropolitan Police? Well, he's being hounded, bullied, abused, and had his pay stopped. So it's quite clear to see. We'll stress the point for our overseas viewers. The picture we think we're looking at is a British government riddled with fraud, corruption and child abuse, or at least the cover-up of child abuse. It's not a nice picture.
An opportunity to bring Vanessa in because John Pilger is heading up the bill on media on trial, which is being promoted by Froome Stop War. This is on Thursday, the 19th of October in Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church. And Patrick Henningsen will be speaking at that as well. You'll be speaking, Vanessa, Peter Ford, and a number of others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would obviously highly recommend it. I mean, you know, we're living in such an insane age at the moment where Bana Alabed's book has just been published, Dear World, and is, of course, doing the rounds in New York and in the UK. And, of course, you know, again, basically, this is children's literature effectively produced by a family that is known to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda in Aleppo and now in Turkey, which is Bana Alabed's family, her father in particular. And of course, with the White Helmets being re-nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 2017, I mean, you know, effectively, when we look at the number of Al-Qaeda members that are being platformed by our media in the West, or even, I mean, I discovered yesterday that one of the Al-Qaeda members in East Aleppo had actually co-written an article for The Times we have this extraordinary situation, really, where corporate media is pretty much platforming an Al-Qaeda narrative, both in the way that they promote and support it, in Syria in particular, but also they're actually having individuals who are affiliated, who are actually members of Al-Qaeda and associated extremist groups in Syria, appearing on their channels and producing articles for them. So this event is incredibly important, I think, to really punch holes in the fabric of corporate media subterfuge, obfuscation, and downright lies.
And it says something, doesn't it, that John Pilger is willing to take part in this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He's definitely taking part in it. Yeah, so he will be speaking. I'm not sure yet of the running order, but we're incredibly honoured to have John Pilger join us. I mean, I think he must be all of our, certainly for me, one of the greatest influences of my opinions and learning curve on imperialism and on intervention on the media. So an extraordinary privilege to have him there, yeah.
Details of this are on Eventbrite with tickets. Do get along if you can. My understanding is that if there's any profit made out of this, that money is going to go to help the situation in Yemen. So anybody that is contributing to this is also contributing to that, and so I urge everybody to get along to this if they can. Now, Vanessa, of course, you began with Gaza really, and spent time in Gaza, you're working closely with Patrick Henningsen at 21st Century Wire now, but you still have your personal website, which is The Wall Will Fall. I was fascinated earlier in the week to see this and other mainstream media covering this issue of Hamas and Fatah apparently getting together, and Al Jazeera here asking, is Hamas-Fatah rapprochement a win-win deal? And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on this and what's driving it, and what the potential outcomes are going to be.
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly complex situation, and I think what everybody has to bear in mind is that at the core of much of what is happening in the region, but particularly in Syria, Syria itself perceives Palestinian liberation, freedom as the core issue in its resistance against the axis of imperialism and intervention that has been waging an illegal proxy war against Syria for the last 7 years. But what I think is quite interesting about this sudden evolution, or this sudden development of events, Gaza, we know, was literally bombed into oblivion in 2014, and of course since then it's been on 100% lockdown. The promised rebuilding has simply not happened. I was reading something the other day about the sheer depression and demotivation for a very young population of Gaza, 1.8 million, probably more now, but the majority of whom are in their sort of late teens, early 20s. So a very young population with basically no future, living a life amongst the rubble of war from 2014. The electricity is controlled by pretty much everything. All of their facilities are controlled by Israel, largely. And so what we've been seeing with obviously the advancing victory of the Syrian Arab Army and its allies in Syria, we've seen a degree of a rapprochement between Hamas and what were their traditional allies, Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah. And I think what we're seeing now is a maneuvering by the Zionist entity, by the illegal state of Israel, to prevent any degree of this rapprochement with what they consider to be a very dangerous axis of resistance, of course, Hezbollah being their nemesis in the region. And so what we've seen now is a maneuvering and the bringing back in of Mohammed Dalan, who is a known rogue entity, certainly a criminal entity, He was responsible for creating effectively death squads in around 2007 that were attacking Hamas within Gaza itself. He's a known rival to Abbas, the current leader of the Fatah party. And he's been effectively absorbed into United Arab Emirates society and culture. And this is where this push is coming from. And again, this is very interesting because the UAE has played a very Machiavellian role in creating, or to a large degree, manipulating the rift between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And again, we're seeing them being employed here. Bearing in mind that, of course, UAE will be recognized very favorably by the neoconservative elites in America, but also by the Zionist entity itself. And basically what they're doing is trying to financially and economically drive a wedge between Hamas and its primary financier, which is Qatar. So we're seeing again UAE playing, as I said, this sort of Machiavellian role. Dalan has just met with a Hamas delegation in Egypt, and in June, Dalan actually negotiated with Egypt to deliver 1 million litres of fuel to Gaza, but only after Tel Aviv, in collaboration with the Palestinian Authority, had reduced Gaza's electricity by almost half. So we see again this manipulation of the situation. Tel Aviv will turn off the tap, and UAE has stepped in, or through Dalan, they've stepped in with Egypt producing the fuel to keep them going. So Gaza is always kept on this level of starvation, deprivation, humanitarian tragedy, which is just always kept from the brink by one of the many financiers that are trying to get a foothold there. And I think the big danger here is one, my fear is, and this was written about by an author called Oliver Tickle in 2014 during the war. We know that Egypt has basically erased Egyptian Rafah, the city of Rafah, or the town of Rafah, completely sort of erased it from the planet. It's been bulldozed away. And the great fear is that the Gazan people, having lived in such dreadful circumstances since 2014, may be tempted to be pushed out from Gaza and into the Sinai, which of course releases all of Gaza as real estate and territory for Israel to take over. And that leaves only some very small ghettoized areas in the occupied territories, which is still Palestine. So this is it's a very real danger, and there is definite maneuvering going on here. One, to get the UAE's foot in the door and influence on the power base, or rather the leadership in Palestine and in Gaza, well, in Gaza and the occupied territories. So it's a very difficult one to sort of disentangle, but Dalan is not a good element in this. He's a criminal, corrupt element that is being brought in by the Emirates to try and drive a wedge between Hamas and Qatar, but not only between Hamas and Qatar, to prevent, as I say, the rapprochement between Hamas and their erstwhile allies, Syria, Iran and Hezbollah, because of course Hamas has been responsible actually for much of the destabilization in pockets of Syria. It has actually turned against the Syrian government during the 7-year war in Syria.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, look, let's move on to Syria and Sergei Lavrov's comments, speaking to an Arab newspaper yesterday, getting a bit cross, and rightly so, about the US and the so-called coalition's activities in Syria, and the continuing claims by the so-called coalition that it's having any major impact on ISIS at all. He was asked, how do you assess the performance of the international coalition against ISIS as led by the United States? What are the limits of the Russian role in the war on ISIS? And he said, I don't want to go into detail, but one should start by saying that from the point of view of Syrians and international law, this coalition is a gatecrasher in Syria. When double standards are applied, he said, when terrorists are divided into the bad and the not so bad ones, when the coalition recruits its members on political grounds, disregarding the need for UN Security Council approval of its activities, one can hardly expect an effective fight against terrorism. He said the US forces' activities in Syria cause many questions. In some cases, these forces mount allegedly accidental airstrikes against Syrian armed forces, after which the Islamic State counterattacks. In other cases, they inspire other terrorists to attack strategic locations over which official Damascus has restored its legitimate authority, or stage fatal provocations against our military personnel. I would also mention several accidental, in inverted commas, strikes against civilian infrastructure that have taken hundreds of civilian lives. Our participation in the fight against ISIS is aimed at both ensuring the national security of Russia and strengthening global and regional security. The use of force alone is not enough to eradicate terrorism in the Middle East and North Africa. We're convinced of that. Our policy has an advantage, as it is not intended to serve vested interests and has no hidden agenda. In this context, we will further expand our efforts to settle numerous crises and conflicts in the region through peaceful political and diplomatic means. We would also welcome everyone who's willing to engage in this joint, honest work. And, you know, I know if I say this, Vanessa, that I'm going to be criticized as being a mouthpiece for the Russians. But the fact of the matter is that when you compare at least the outward look of Russia and compare that with the words and the deeds of the British Foreign Office and the US Department of State, you know, it's chalk and cheese, and there seems to be Russia every day seems to demonstrate a more mature foreign policy than we seem to be able to expect from our own so-called leaders.
Well, you know, it's extraordinary. They work on the basis of the supremacy of law, and that's the simple basis of their actions and reactions. Whereas our governments are demonstrating themselves to be lawless rogue states. The US coalition is carrying out, as Lavrov has said, as we've all been saying, but they're carrying out murderous campaigns inside Syria and Iraq. I mean, you know, we're hearing the number of civilian corpses and bodies that are being discovered in Mosul, for example. And, you know, we see this juxtaposition of the Russian and Syrian cooperative campaigns, for example, in Aleppo, where we know that they opened up humanitarian corridors, where they worked to actually liberate the civilians with as little civilian casualty as possible. Whereas the US in Deir ez-Zor, when they're claiming to be bombing ISIS targets, in Raqqa, when they're again claiming to be bombing ISIS targets in Mosul, we see effectively, you know, the US strategy of carpet bombing with zero regard for civilian lives. As Lavrov again has pointed out, they've deliberately targeted Syrian coalition forces, most recently hitting Hezbollah, but also targeting Russian forces on the ground near Deir ez-Zor. So, you know, this is extraordinary. We are effectively seeing a war playing out here, because the US is in Syria without any form of legality or mandate, or you know, it's completely acting as a rogue state, and it is effectively targeting now Russian positions, but Russian allied positions. So in other words, allies of Syria being Russia. And so really, it is a covert war that is being waged in Syria at the moment. And I think we're seeing a huge global paradigm shift, in the sense that you know, power is based on two things. It's based on force, or it's based on trust. But the one that is based on trust is the one that will last. The US is based entirely on force. Nobody trusts it. Nobody believes it. And Syria has exposed to what extent it has deceived the world for decades. Whereas Russia is emerging as an honest broker in international affairs, and it has adhered to international law. And going forward, that is the only thing that is going to protect other prey nations from the same fate as Syria, Libya, Iraq, Ukraine, and so on, is international law and the adherence to international law, an institution that is not captive to US neocolonialism, such as is the UN, but an organization that is genuinely upholding international law and ensuring that law is maintained at all costs. And that is basically what Russia is saying. And so to most thinking people, it makes sense. And you're right, everyone's going to say, we're just Russophiles, we're Putinists, etc. But that's just a ridiculous way of trying to dismiss a solid argument, which is the fact that even if Russia has an agenda, they do tend to make that agenda pretty clear. They've been very open about their strategy. They've been very open about the reasons why they got involved in the first place. So I think huge respect to them for the way that they are, to a large extent, maneuvering around this chessboard and exposing the United States and its coalition, particularly the UK, to be duplicitous, deceitful, absolutely lawless, murderous regimes. And I have to say murderous because the number of civilians that have been killed in the US coalition attacks, not only directly from them, but obviously through their proxies also on the ground. And just coming back to that bad terrorists or slightly less bad terrorists, yes, this myth that has underpinned the entire proxy war effort in Syria for 7 years, it should be completely consigned to kind of room 101 of propaganda. It's insanity.
Absolutely.
When we dig carefully, Vanessa, it is so easy to expose these people for what they are. The British government funding terrorism, and here's the truth coming to light now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? We heard Madeleine Albright say that the starvation of 500,000 Iraqi children was a price that was worth it. We've seen Hillary Clinton cackling over the death and sodomization of Gaddafi. We see there was a report in Reuters actually yesterday, and I'll just read it, the sort of the front paragraph. Israel's defense minister said on Tuesday President Bashar al-Assad was winning Syria's civil war and urged the United States to weigh in as Damascus's Iranian and Hezbollah allies gain ground. So in other words, there's always behind each of these interventions and these humanitarian disasters, I mean, even in Yemen, where we know that it's of biblical proportions, the human suffering that is going on in Yemen, when we see the depth of depravity and profiteering from this human misery, if we take one thing away from this, is that we should never, ever, ever believe one word that comes out of these creatures' mouths when they claim that they are intervening in any other nation under a humanitarian pretext. Please, I urge everybody to at least take that away, because when you see Boris making a speech like this, as you say, literally planning to build some sort of opulent, palatial, corporate elite city on the bones and the carcasses and the corpses of our government's criminal actions in Libya, then please do not believe him when he turns around and tells us that they are in Syria to save lives or that they are in Yemen to prevent human disaster. Please, we have to stop buying into this humanitarian cloak of invisibility that is draped over their criminal atrocities and their murderous acts in all of these nations into which they have intervened.
So I'm just briefly going to cover this. Now, early in September, we were talking about the Russian military exercises taking place in Belarus, Zapad 2017. All kinds of hysteria over that, mainly being driven from NATO and the UK. Well, here we've got one voice of sanity, Stars and Stripes. This is from the 20th of September, after Zapad 2017 had finished. After all the anxiety, Russia's Zapad exercise ends without provocation, was the headline. Now, why am I mentioning an article from the 20th of September? Because the hysteria continues. It just is unbelievable. This exercise has come and gone. It was an exercise based on a scenario of internal insurgency. It wasn't anything internationalist at all. It wasn't the type of scenario that NATO has been using with just about every exercise that they've been running over the last couple of years. But here we go, article after article. So this is Eric Schmidt in the New York Times. Vast exercise demonstrated Russia's growing military prowess. This is the Jamestown Journal or whatever it's called, Zapad 2017, a test for the West. We've got Chatham House, 5 things to know about the Zapad 2017 military exercise. These are all published within the last few days, Brian, yesterday and a couple of days ago. And Newsweek, how Russia got away with masking a war game of more than 40,000 troops. The hysteria continues, and anybody that suggests that, you know, anybody that's criticizing this is simply a mouthpiece for the Russians needs their heads examined, because this, what we're seeing in the media, is absolute insanity.
Well, insanity and very carefully crafted propaganda by the West. And I do find it astonishing to sit here in 2017. The world is reversed from those Cold War days where the propaganda appeared to come from one side. We're now seeing such a sleek Western propaganda machine. Vanessa, just a few seconds closing comment, if you wish.
Where's Morgan Freeman?
Yes. Is that it then?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, super. Thank you.
I think that just sums up the whole ridiculousness of the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's become a Hollywood exercise. It's not even based in any sort of reality or truth or fact.
Yeah.
I mean, it's extraordinary. In the meantime, of course, you know, the Russian embassy in Washington is being raided, which is by the United States officials, which I just, you know, nobody's paying any attention to this. I mean, this is a highly aggressive act that is being committed by American officials in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Yeah. Vanessa, as always, thank you very much for joining us. What an incredible news as these pieces come together so quickly and so clearly. But the facts remain that we are looking at a criminal elite running both the UK and the USA. They need to be removed in an appropriate way if we're going to sort these problems out. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.